So, good morning, everyone. It is 9 a.m. on the West Coast, and I'm Alex Boo, co-director of the BGK Center's Coordination Center. So last time in this series, we completed our discussions on data modeling and inference, and today we kind of shift gears to talk about some other topics of interest in biomedical big data. So the first topic we'll be covering is one of growing interest, open science. Questions around making science transparent and reproducible and of making it available has important implications, not just within the academic and scientific communities, but to the broader public. And with us today is Dr. Brian Nosek, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. Dr. Nosek is co-founder and executive director of the Center of Open Science, which advocates and supports the practice of open science on a global scale. In 2015, he was named on Nature's 10 list, and he's also on the Chronicle for Higher Education Influence list. Brian, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm looking forward to hearing more about open science and your perspectives on how we as a community can enable it. And with that, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alex. I'm very happy to be speaking with this group today. The term open science is an unusual term because it is essentially redundant, right? Scientific claims don't become credible based on authority or insistence that they're true or logical argument. They become credible based on the availability of the evidence that support the scientific claim. So that includes the outcome, the report of what the person, how they summarize, how they did their research and arrived at those claims. It includes the materials and methodology that was the basis for generating the evidence or applying analytics to the data that are generated, and the data itself that are the content that supports that claim. So the fact that we have a discussion and an unusual term about open science isn't suggesting something about a different way of doing science, but rather the fact that the values of openness in science are not consistent necessarily with the daily practice of how science is operating today. And so really the open science movement is about, I think, values in addressing the gap between daily practice and core principles of how science is presumed to operate. So one way to start is to review what are those core principles of what makes science science as a way of knowing, as a way of learning about the world. And Robert Merton talked about these in the 1940s and 50s when he was trying to characterize the norms of science or the values of science. So one, he identified communality, the open sharing of information. Claims become credible based on the sharing of the evidence supporting those claims. Versus the counter norm, secrecy. Nope, you just gotta trust me. I'm a scientist. I know what I'm talking about. Just believe me. Right? A second, universalism. Research is evaluated based on its own merit, right? The evidence itself is the basis of deciding whether the claims are credible or not. Versus particularism, evaluating research based on the authority, the prestige, the eminence of the person making the claim. A third that Merton identified was disinterestedness. Researchers are motivated by knowledge and discovery versus the counter norm of self-interestedness, just trying to get ahead of the person down the hall. Right? Likewise, researchers consider all new evidence, even against prior work. Organized skepticism versus the counter norm of organized dogmatism. I spend my career finding the initial results and then fighting off all of the attackers in my field to defend my particular point of view, my theory, my findings. And while Merton didn't talk about it, a lot of philosophers and sociologists of science have talked about a norm of quality as compared to the counter norm of quantity. Now, those may be easily recognizable values or norms of how science is perceived, but a question is, do actually researchers endorse those norms? Do they buy in to these as the values of science compared to those counter norms that they could buy into? Anderson and her colleagues did a large-scale survey of NIH awardees. Something like 3,300 people were in their sample to see whether they endorsed the counter norms or the norms. And this graph here shows early career, which means people that were in a postdoctoral award. Mid-career were folks that were in their first R01 award, so average age around 40. And what I'm showing you here is a cumulative plot of the responses to that survey, where the gray indicates people who endorse the norms over the counter norms on average, whereas black are those that endorse the counter norms over the norms on average. So what you're seeing is 90% or so of the participants in this survey said that they endorse those norms of science over the counter norms. And the gray hatched lines are people that said, well, I sort of endorse both of these equally. So there's broad endorsement for the norms of science. But then Anderson and her colleagues said, okay, that's fine. Don't tell me what you endorse. Tell me how you behave in your everyday research. And it looks like this. So mostly, still more than 60% of early and mid-career researchers say that they behave according to the norms of science. But many are acknowledging that those counter norms of competition, of trying to get ahead, of keeping information themselves, of dogmatic thinking, are driving their behavior to some degree. And still, most people do not say that they don't behave according to the counter norms over the norms. Then they said, okay, don't tell me what you do as an individual. Tell me what the people in your area of research, how do they behave? And the distribution of responses looks like this. So most people perceive that their community, their culture around them, behaves more according to the counter norms rather than the norms of science. And this is a challenging situation because the gap between what my values are, those first graphs of saying I want to be open, I want to be reproducible work, I want to be skeptical about my own work, versus what I perceive is reinforced, is incentivized, is the dominant behavior in my culture, creates a gap between how I think science should be done and how I think it is being done, and what it takes to be successful in the field. And that's a significant challenge, and part of what is characterized as the reproducibility crisis, or whatever term you want to use, that's been in discussion in the last few years, is a lot of different kinds of behaviors that may be good for advancing one's own career, making one's research more publishable, but not necessarily good for the accuracy or the reproducibility of the evidence. And there are lots and lots of research and discussions about the various areas of limitation in the quality or rigor or reproducibility of work, but we can characterize some of the main ones like this, right? Low power. Most of the investigations of the power of research design suggests that we don't even have enough power to detect the effects that we are detecting, increasing both the likelihood of type 1 errors, false positives, and type 2 errors, false negatives. Researchers have remarkable flexibility in the kinds of analyses that they do of the same data, and then can select among those which are the analyses that are most favorable to their interests, whether that interest is publication or their particular point of view or whatever else. I do many experiments in my lab, and only a subset of them get into papers. So what is that process of selective reporting? What ends up getting filtered out? And is that a biasing influence over the reliability of the work that's end up produced? Right? Null results are considered less interesting, even less interpretable than positive results, leading to them being more likely to be ignored or not published or not even written up for potential publication. And the main driver of scientific success is innovation, finding out new possibilities, what things could be true, pushing new areas of interest that motivate new theoretical domains or new possibilities. And there aren't good incentives for replication, for verifying findings that have been proposed, for increasing the reliability of the estimates of effects that have been observed. And so as a consequence, there's lots and lots of innovation, but without practices of verification, of skepticism, of questioning, of extending in incremental but cumulative ways. Now, these are problems that have been well discussed in the literature, and not just in the last 5 or 6 years. The references that I have below are just a sample of the many methodologist discussions about these very issues that occurred in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and all of the solutions that are being discussed now for how we can increase reproducibility are the same kinds of solutions that were identified during that time period, suggesting that we understand what the problem is and what the solutions are. We just haven't developed effective mechanisms for addressing it. And so at the Center for Open Science, we exist as a nonprofit technology company that has a mission to increase openness, integrity, and reproducibility of research. And I want to just during this presentation today give you an overview of some of the activities that we have for trying to nudge the practices of science to be more aligned with those core values. So the sort of the center of what we think is the key challenge for increasing openness and reproducibility in research is that the incentives for my success as a practicing researcher are focused on me getting it published, not getting it right. So the mechanisms of reward, my likelihood of getting my job, of getting tenure, of getting advanced in my career, depend, at least the easy way to characterize it is depend on me publishing as frequently as possible in the most prestigious outlets that I can. And not everything gets published. So positive results are more likely to get published than negative results. Novel results more likely to be published than replications or redundant results. And clean and tidy stories where everything fits together in a nice sequence are more likely to get published than ones that have lots of exceptions, lots of things that are uncertain. Positive, novel, clean results are a gold mine. Those are the golden egg that we might shoot for because those are more important, better results. But of course, in few laboratories does that happen very often. Right? We don't get positive, novel, clean, and tidy results very easily because we're studying problems that we don't understand. That's why we're studying them. And progress is halting. We get lots of exceptions, lots of things that don't make sense, many things that don't fit together, lots of false starts. And that's just the process of doing research. But all the incentives are pointing us to turning that loop that's happening in the lab into beautiful stories at the end that show a clean and tidy sequence that may be more beautiful than the evidence actually supports. And that's where a lot of the key challenges are, is that the published literature may appear to be more reliable, more complete, more credible than the evidence supporting it actually is, because we don't actually see all of the evidence that has been generated and is being used to make the claims that appear in the literature. So there are a lot of barriers to trying to address and make all of that research process more transparent so that it can be evaluated by the research community, for the research community to be able to do what the promise of research is, which is to be self-correcting. We cannot self-correct if we don't know the basis of evidence for the claims. We can only self-correct based on what we can see. And of course, the papers that come out of the research process from my lab, David Donahoe at Stanford characterized as advertising for the research, not research itself. It's my best description of what I think is important about the work that we did that makes it as publishable as possible and also makes it clear and tidy and interesting to the reader. But of course, the things behind it are where the real research are, the materials, the methodology, the protocols, the data, all of that work that is what generated the research. That's the real research itself. So how can we make more of that accessible so that the research community can be self-correcting? Well, there's a number of important barriers. One of them are those perceived norms that we just talked about on the initial slide, where I see the culture being one of secrecy, of people advancing their careers, of being dogmatic in their approach, and I don't see myself wanting to do that, but I'm confronted with a choice. I can either stay true to the values that I have, wanting to do science as it's supposed to be done, but at the cost of career advancement, because I see that there are other practices that are accelerating people's careers, or I could give in and sacrifice some of those values and be able to advance my career by doing some of the behaviors that are better for career advancement, even though they might not be better for science. And that's a difficult situation for anyone to be in. A second barrier is that we have these amazing frontal lobes that give us lots of flexibility in reasoning, where when we're confronted by multiple ways we could analyze the data, some of them look better for publication than others, multiple studies that we could use to be the basis of our claims, some of which look better for publication or for our existing theories than others, that we are likely to employ our reasoning, not as reasoning to arrive at a conclusion, but as rationalization to justify a conclusion that we already have. And that is a lion's share of how reasoning actually works, is that we have existing beliefs and we look for information that helps to support our existing beliefs, our existing stakes, so that we employ things like confirmation bias, seeking information consistent with our current points of view. We employ hindsight bias. Once we see results, we look at the results that are best for us and say, oh, of course, that's how we would have done this study. That's the right kind of result to pay attention to. That's what I would have expected to have occurred. And so all of those reasoning strategies may unintentionally, without me even being aware that I'm employing them, may be shaping the literature coming out of my lab to look better than it actually is. A third barrier is that a lot of that happens with very little accountability. None of you know what happens in my lab. All you get to see are the reports at the end. And so I don't have the conditions, the situation of perspective taking, of as we are reasoning through trying to do our research, of thinking about how would an observer evaluate the decisions that we're making here, the decision to drop that study, to amplify that analysis, to suppress that analysis. Would they think that that is a reasonable thing to do? And as we know from a lot of research on accountability, that perspective taking, or knowing that someone could observe what I'm doing, fundamentally changes how I think about those problems, what decisions I make about what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it. And then lastly, we're very busy. We're all very busy. And so the ideas of being more transparent, of making our data more accessible, of opening up our materials, our process of research, all of those are perceived, and in reality many times, as an extra work, as an appendage on the existing workflows. And if in a competitive landscape like science, in a place where we are overcommitted already with the variety of projects that we're trying to pursue and understand and do, we are not likely to be easily amenable to adding on new things that we have to do in order to make that research more accessible, especially if we're not incentivized to do it. If there's no reward for me making my data, my materials, my protocols more open, then why would I spend that extra time doing it, even with the values of desiring that as a good outcome? So those are formidable barriers, and there's a lot that needs to change in the culture in order to try to address improvements of openness and reproducibility as ordinary practice. So there are a few areas that the Center for Open Science focuses on to try to maximize the likelihood that we can move to a more open and reproducible research culture. First strategy is that we are primarily a technology company. We have a staff of 55, and about 2/3 of that staff, full-time staff, 55, there's interns as well. But about 2/3 of that staff is building tools like the Open Science Framework to enable researchers to be more open with their research. We also provide training, as many others do, for how to be more open and reproducible in research practices. And then the third is providing some means of shifting, nudging those incentives that drive our behavior through funders, through journals, through institutions, so that researchers have a reason to embrace moving toward more open practices. So what I'd like to do for the rest of the time that we have is to summarize some of our activities of these, and then we'll be delighted to have some questions and discussion about what other barriers or what opportunities there are to try to align scientific values and practices more closely. So let me start with sort of the big picture view of how do we shift incentives given the cultural challenges that we face in science. And we can characterize this in very simple terms, sort of a psychology 101 perspective on scientific behavior. And that is to think about what are the means with which researchers get the rewards that they get, and those being the primary drivers of behavior. So right now, my primary means of getting the key reward, publication, are focused on the outcomes of the research. The things that we do in the lab, the more likely we are to have novel, positive, clean results, the more likely I am to get that reward that I need, publication and publication in prestigious outlets. So if this is the singular model of incentive, of reward, then everything hinges on outcomes, on producing amazing, sexy, exciting results, and everything else is essentially irrelevant to how it is I advance in my career. So how do we change that model so that it isn't just a singular reward system? Well, one obvious thing to do is add additional means. So instead of me just being rewarded on the outcomes that I produce, can we also nudge those incentives so that sometimes, or in part, I'm rewarded on the process by which I pursue those outcomes, right? The quality of my methodology, the accessibility, the transparency of that methodology, evidence for reproducibility of the process by which I generate my findings. If those can also be a mechanism of reward, then it isn't just the outcomes, although we will never get rid of outcomes because people who discover more amazing things will be rewarded more than people who don't. But we can add additional means of getting rewards so that the process also is part of career advancement. Likewise, we can diversify the rewards So it isn't just getting publication and having the journal article be the sole mechanism of advancement, but also the generation of important research content, right? So a person who generates an amazingly important data set should be rewarded for that as a scholarly unit of its own. The data being a mechanism of scholarly advancement. The materials, the analytic scripts and code that are generated are themselves scholarly contributions and could be credited as such rather than having it solely be through the getting your name on a paper and particularly getting your name first or last on that paper. So most of our strategies are thinking about ways to diversify means and rewards across the existing incentive structures that drive researchers' behaviors today. So let me start with an example that's a trivially easy or simple one, and that is to signal desirable behaviors. So this is an example of badges to reward open practices. So we developed these badges, and there's a committee of researchers from a variety of different fields that help maintain the specifications for what it means to have open data or open materials or have pre-registered your research design, define in advance what you're doing, how you're going to do it. A journal can adopt these badges, and then when my paper gets accepted, can invite me to say, would you like any of these badges to be attached to your paper so that it appears there, and if you can meet the specifications, then you get the badge, and then there will be a link, for example, with open data to how someone can access your data in an independent repository. Now, badges are silly, they're a trivial thing, but in this case, they are signals of something that's valued in the research community. Openness is valued, but no one knows when someone else is being open in their practices, right? There aren't any signals for doing those extra things to be more open or transparent in one's work. And so providing a signal of evidence that someone is doing a desirable behavior, especially when it's not easy to see otherwise, could be a powerful shift, very simple but powerful shift in the incentives that drive individual researchers' behaviors. They may be more willing to do those extra steps just to be able to signal that they care about these issues, that they are pursuing open practices. So we worked with the journal Psychological Science as the first journal that adopted badges, and they adopted in January 1st, 2014. And what I'm showing you here is an investigation of the effect of badges, this new policy of offering badges at Psychological Science compared to 4 comparison journals in psychology. And the y-axis is showing the percent of articles for every half year from 2012 to the end of 2013 for the percent of articles that said that data were available in an independent repository. And Psychological Science in black shows about 3% of their articles on average each half year had data available in a repository. And the other journals likewise had low amounts. So then Psychological Science adopts badges January 1st, 2014. And then this is what happens. So by the first half of 2015, 39% of the articles in Psychological Science had open data in an independent repository. And the only change was the introduction of this policy, of the opportunity to apply for a badge on the article that has no implications other than signaling to the others in your research community that you did this particular practice. So it is a trivial change, but it had an inordinately strong impact on behavior, 13-fold increase in the rates of data sharing, at least in this example. And so it isn't magical or brilliant in any particular way. It's just leveraging the fact that these values already exist. As I showed you on that first slide of Anderson and her colleagues, people already endorse the norm of openness. They're just not rewarded for behaving that way. And so by providing a simple signal that can dramatically increase people's likelihood of adhering to the values that they already have, and doing so in effective ways. Okay, so that's one example. To introduce the next example, I want to just give a research example of this challenge of selective reporting and how it can make the published literature look more credible than it is. And there's lots of good research examples in clinical trials and other fields for this. This example comes from the social sciences. And what I'm showing you here is a comparison of studies that were pre-registered and what the methodology was going to be done versus what was actually reported in the paper that came out in the end. So Annie Franco and her colleagues took advantage of a NSF-funded project called TESS. This is Time Series Experiments in Social Sciences. And what TESS is it's a coordinated effort to give researchers in these disciplines access to a representative sample of adults to do experiments. Those are very precious samples that are hard to get and recruit and maintain. And so this is a valued resource. And so what researchers in the field can do is they can design their protocol and then they submit it to TESS for peer review. And if TESS accepts it, then TESS runs that protocol on this representative sample of US adults and then sends you the data. The condition for the researchers for getting access to this as a free resource is that you have to make your protocol public and the data public so that others can review it. And so what this creates is this opportunity to see what was actually in the research, because we almost never, in basic and preclinical sciences, almost never know what the precise methodology was, just what was in the report, versus what ends up in the report. What do they say they did in their project? And so what I'm showing you on the left here, on the x-axis is the number of experimental conditions or treatment arms that were actually in the study from 0 to 5 in the questionnaire, in the data as it was collected. On the y-axis is the number of experimental conditions or treatment arms that were reported in the paper where they said that these conditions did occur. And what you can see is that if every paper reported all of the conditions that were in the experiment, then all of the dots would be on the diagonal line. But 40% of the studies in this case left out one or more of the experimental conditions, just didn't mention that they had occurred in the paper, even though they had occurred in the protocol. On the panel on the right is the same thing, but now with the outcome variables. So on the x-axis is showing the number of outcome variables that were actually in the experiment as it was conducted. And on the y-axis is the number of outcome variables that were reported in the paper at the end in the published article. 70% of the articles left out one or more of the outcome variables that was actually in the study. Now, it's possible that that happens for a lot of different reasons, and it may not be consequential if there's no particular bias in what's likely to be reported in the paper versus what's likely to be left out. But because this is open data, Franco and her colleagues were able to follow up and look at what was included and what was excluded from the paper. And what they found was that for the 122 reported tests that were included in the paper, the median p-value was 0.02, so they were positive results, right? P less than 0.05 is the standard metric for deciding whether you obtain a positive result. The median effect size was 0.29, so almost a third of a standard deviation approximately, and 63% of the results that were reported were positive results. So then they went, because they have the access to the raw data, to the outcome variables that weren't reported. And what they observed is that there were 147 of those. The median p-value is 0.35. The median effect size was 0.13, less than half. And only 23% of those were significant effects. So this suggests that there is a substantial bias in what outcomes are likely to get reported in the paper, positive outcomes, compared to the outcomes that were actually observed, suggesting that the reported research, the papers at the end, were more beautiful, more clean, better stories than the data actually suggested. So that's a significant challenge, and it's only identifiable because we can tell the difference between what was planned at the outset and what was done and reported at the end. And this is related to a very important distinction in the philosophy of science, which is two different modes of research, right? In one mode, we are in the context of justification. We have a hypothesis that we want to acquire data to test. And so this, in hypothesis testing mode, we are in confirmatory approach to analysis, right? We are laying out a hypothesis, a methodology, a way we're going to analyze the data that we obtain from that methodology, and then we go out and get data and then confront our hypothesis with the data. So the decisions in this case about the hypothesis and the analysis plan are independent of the data itself. You don't get to know what the data are because you have to make your commitments to what your hypothesis and how you would analyze it in advance in order to confront that hypothesis. The other mode of analysis is when we're in the context of discovery, where we're using data in order to generate hypotheses. We're getting in the weeds and looking at data where we don't have a clear sense of a hypothesis or an overall theory, and we're exploring that in order to see where things might occur, so that once we can generate those hypotheses, once we have ideas, we can then later confront them, do a different study in order to test those hypotheses. Those decisions in the context of exploration are data contingent. We're using the data to inform how we are analyzing the data. The importance of this distinction is, it's important for a number of reasons, but there is a practice that is central to making clear when we're in one mode of analysis or the other. And both of these modes are critical for scientific advancement. And the key thing that pre-registration does is clarify when we are in the context of discovery versus the context of justification, because mixing these two up has important implications. So why is this distinction important? Well, the typical tools of statistical inference, using p-values, for example, in null hypothesis significance testing, are interpretable only in the context of confirmation, where you know precisely the number and kind of inference tests you're going to do, and then can apply corrective processes for the number of tests versus the likelihood of them being false positives. But when we're in the context of discovery, when we're making choices contingent on the data, p-values lose their diagnosticity. They don't have the informative meaning that they have, because there are many possible analyses we could have done that we either did do and ignored or didn't do because we didn't think to do them, given what we saw in the data itself. Andrew Gelman, for example, calls this the garden of forking paths. When you're confronted with many possibilities as you observe the data, many of those paths wither away very easily, quickly, and you never pursue them. If you hadn't known the data, you might have pursued those tests. And so that causes the fact that the p-values are not interpretable in that context, are non-diagnostic, increases the likelihood of false discoveries when you're in exploratory mode, when you're using p-values to draw inferences. So the key challenge for not distinguishing via pre-registration when you're in the context of justification versus discovery is that presenting exploratory results as confirmatory can increase the publishability, right? I see more positive results, I get more interested in those, I start to draw interpretations and theories that explain those, but at the cost of their credibility, of the likelihood that they are false positives and not aligned with reality. So in the ideal model of how research operates, because we're doing all of these simultaneously, is one where we would generate a study, right? We do studies for some reason, and we write down, why is it that we are doing this study? What is the purpose of this study? What are we trying to find or infer? And many times we get into a new domain with very little idea of where it might go. But we have some idea. So it may be a very simple, we're going to try this one thing to start, but really this is an exploratory investigation. So we write down what that is. We commit to that in advance as our very constrained view of what we're testing as a hypothesis. And this is now routine in my lab. We pre-register everything. Once we've analyzed the data in that very simple way that we started, then we take that data set and we explore the heck out of it. We move into exploratory mode of analysis where we are trying to now unpack this phenomenon, where we had some interesting questions, but we had very little idea of what direction to go. And that exploratory mode of analysis gives us now some ideas, some hypotheses that we can start to shape the phenomenon that we're investigating, that then inspires the next study. And in that study, we can pre-register our design. Now that we have some hypotheses, pre-register what we're going to do to test that and how we're going to analyze it. And then move right back into exploratory mode once we discover how wrong we were that time too. And then back and forth and back and forth. So this concept of pre-registration is well known now in clinical sciences because it's law for certain types of clinical trials, but it is relatively unknown and certainly not practiced in most basic and preclinical areas of research. And even though the value may be seen as clear, there is lack of familiarity because it often is disruptive to the workflows that we have for how it is we do our research, whether it's experimental data collections, whether it's working with existing data sets or otherwise. There are lots of different ways in which we can create better distinctions between our confirmatory and exploratory modes of analysis. So one initiative that we have to try to promote awareness and education about the value of pre-registration is called the Preregistration Challenge, and you can visit it at the link here. The idea of the Preregistration Challenge is that we are giving $1,000 awards to the first 1,000 researchers that publish the results of a pre-registered study in an eligible journal. Really, the goal for this is an awareness and education campaign. So when you go to the website, you get lots of information about what pre-registration is, how it works, some background reading materials, process information, and then there's a guided workflow that helps researchers sort of take the steps for how they can pre-register their study and actually walk them through pre-registration of a research design. And then a very rapid review process to confirm that all of the things that were pre-registered, and then the person goes ahead and does their research. So our expectation is that once researchers try pre-registration for their area of work, because it's a high barrier to initiate, because it is a disruption to the ordinary workflow, but once they try it, it is relatively likely to become a habit, because very quickly one can experience the benefits of pre-registration. I mentioned before that my lab does pre-registration for all the research we do now, and the benefits are very high because we do a lot more upfront planning and identification of problems before we actually initiate data collection. So we end up being more efficient, not less, because of that planning process. We've had a number of times where we thought we had a design that was going to be effective for testing the hypothesis that we were looking to investigate in the first place, and then discover we had some flaw in the design that wouldn't have allowed us to test it the way that we wanted. So having done that in advance and actually writing down our analysis plan confronts us with that without the waste of the data collection. And likewise, for those areas of research where there's a lot of variations, a paradigmatic approach in the methodology, pre-registration gets very efficient because we pre-register, we develop the protocol for one study, and then we just adapt it incrementally with the experiments as they go through the sequence of research that we do. So that's something that's worth trying out if you have any interest at all. There's another related initiative that really tries to get into the incentives that researchers have driving them now in that publication process. And that's, this one is called Registered Reports, and you can go to the link there to find out more information. So for the context of registered reports, this is the cartoon version of how we do research, right? Design a study, collect and analyze the data, write up a report, and publish it. But of course, it's not that simple. There is that barrier of peer review that's in my way from once I finish that report to actually publishing it. Now, in this standard model, all of the incentives for me to get publication that I need are making that report as likely as possible to make it through peer review. So I need it to be a novel story, I need it to be clean and nice, I need positive results, everything that peer reviewers will not hate. I have to do and try to get that report looking as good as possible. Likewise, for peer reviewers, their incentives are tied into their commitments to the findings that I'm reporting. If I'm in a contentious area of research and I get peer reviewers that like what I found, they may also like the methodology. It reinforces their worldview. Whereas if they don't like what I found, if it challenges a particular finding that they've had or a particular perspective, then they may be much more likely to identify all kinds of problems in the methodology, reinforcing their negative view of the results itself. So what Registered Reports does is shift these incentives by making one simple change to the review process, and that is moving peer review at the journal to right after the design phase. So what I do as an author when I submit a registered report to a journal is I submit the research question, the methodology, the background for why that's an important question, and the methodology that I'm going to use to test that question. And I might have some preliminary experiments, for example, showing the viability of the approach or something. But the results are not known because those experiments have not been done. And the peer reviewers evaluate the quality of the question, the importance of the question, and the quality of the methodology to test that question. Do we need to know the answer to this? And is this methodology effective, efficient, going to be a good way to evaluate the outcomes of this research? And then if that passes peer review, the journal gives an in-principle acceptance to the paper. So they say, we will publish this regardless of whether it's a positive or negative result, as long as that you did follow through with the methodology. You didn't just, remember to turn on magnet and actually get the data, right, et cetera, et cetera. So the key here is that it shifts incentives for everybody in the process just enough. So it's still about getting a publication. That's how the world works that we're in now. But the incentives for me as an author are focused on me asking the most important questions that I can and developing the most robust methodology that I can to test them. Incentives for peer reviewers are now, how can I evaluate this methodology, but also my feedback, instead of saying what you did wrong that you should have done in experiments already finished, now my feedback is, how can I improve your experiment? And so as an author, I can feel more grateful to reviewers for identifying problems at this stage, because I have an opportunity to actually fix them in the methodology before the experiments are done. And so it makes the process much more collaborative. So far, we have 50 journals, I think, that have adopted this as a publishing option in addition to the traditional process of research. And both, it can be a comprehensive replacement, because there's a lot of things that are real discoveries that aren't things that are anticipated in advance. You don't design the study to do, but you get a left turn all of a sudden in doing research. And a lot of those will appear in the normal publication process as it occurs now, or would be things that happen in the introduction for one of these kinds of papers, and then you do a follow-up experiment to really nail that phenomenon that came out of the blue during that line of research. Okay, so those examples, I've given you badges, and pre-registration challenge, and registered reports, are some efforts to try to nudge a variety of the different incentives so that researchers are rewarded for being more open in their practices and trying to pursue practices that are likely to increase the reproducibility of their work, and trying to fit those into the existing reinforcements and reward systems that researchers are living by. The other half, or most of what we spend our time on, is the technology development to support researchers to be more open in their research. And so I want to spend the rest of the time that I have sort of giving an overview of what we're trying to do with the technology to sort of support the shift towards more open practices. And really, that at the core of this is not as a very simple idea for how we can improve research. And that is one that was instructed to us in kindergarten for how we should behave. And that is to show our work and to share. There is very little else that we really need to do at a system level, I think, to improve research practices. One of the great things about science is that it's an open marketplace of ideas. People are feeding ideas, being skeptical of others' ideas, challenging them, extending them, reusing them, transforming them. And over time, some stuff pops out of that brew of marketplace as surviving, as getting through that skeptical process and having some value beyond just the exploration of the idea itself. For that process to work efficiently, the main thing that we need to know is what are the basis of people's claims? How are they arriving at those claims, so that I can actually critique them, so that the process can self-correct? Because without access to the background information, we don't know how to self-correct. We don't know how to critique the findings as effectively as we can. And so if nothing else, if we can make that process more accessible and more transparent, more open, then self-correction will work as we imagine it all could. So that openness from our perspective applies to three different areas of practice. Open access is very familiar, right? Making papers more accessible to more people rather than being behind, for example, subscription services. Open data is a very prominent and ongoing discussion now, is how do we make the content of our research, the data, the materials, the protocols, the code, more accessible to others. But a critical third piece that isn't yet as much of the discussion is open workflow, the process by which I generate those data and the process by which I analyze those data and draw inference. Can we make that more accessible for others? Because that process, like pre-registration, is just as important as the data itself to understand the basis of claims that come out of it. So all three of those are part of the various approaches to building technology and infrastructure tools to help researchers do their research. And all of this is organized through the Open Science Framework, and that's at osf.io. All of the tools we build are free and open source. We build exclusively public goods. And the Open Science Framework is a scholarly commons that has as its first mission to help researchers manage their own research for their own use privately. So when you go to the OSF, you can sign up for an account. When you have an account, you can easily create projects. You add materials and data, things that you're working on those projects to those. Those are all then stored in cloud-based archival services. You can add collaborators to those projects so that they have access to those workspaces as well. And all of that can be done privately. So with the OSF, you never have to make anything public if you don't want to. And the problem that we're trying to solve with this infrastructure by allowing this privacy is researchers maintaining their own data and materials for their own use, right? The person that loses the most information from my research is me, because we have lots of different projects in the lab. We have lots of people coming in and out of the lab, postdocs and graduate students and research assistants. And when one person leaves or one computer dies, a lot of information leaves with them. And so what the OSF solves is that archival problem. Is a cloud-based solution where every project is stored for the lab in that space, and it also has a collective knowledge base. So that postdoc leaves, I don't lose because of that person's ad hoc organization system. I don't lose the information, the data, the source of the materials, the notebook, the electronic notebook, etc. I don't lose that information because that person is gone too. So the key, though, is we solve that problem trying to make this online resource a repository for one's lab's own use, while then simultaneously making it trivial, make parts or all of that more accessible to others, make it open. So on every project and every component of every project, there's a little button that says Make Public. And if I click that button, it says, are you sure you want to make that public? And if I say yes, then that part of the project is public. And so by that, we have integrated private and public workflows so that my lab can be doing its research, and we may have a longitudinal project that we're going to do for many years, and we're not ready to make the data set available, but we are ready to sort of make some of the materials. Other people could use these materials, or they might have ideas for collaborations if they see some of the methodology that we're pursuing. So we make that part of the project public while we continue to work with the other parts privately in the OSF with just the collaborators. So the idea is to reduce the barriers to openness to be trivial barriers, right? Not add on to people's workflow and make it append to their busy work days, but rather provide a tool that has value for maintaining their own research for their own use and make it easy to integrate that private workflow management with making things publicly accessible. At the core of the OSF is an API to connect services around the entire research lifecycle. And so once a particular service is connected to the OSF, then that service is connected to all of the other services that are already connected to the OSF. So these are the services that are connected as of today: Zotero and Mendeley, citation management services, data storage like Google Drive, Box.com, Dropbox, Amazon S3, GitHub for code, JAST Stats for data analysis, and then other archival environments like Figshare and Dataverse. And then we also have a number of other ones that are in development now through grants that we provided to a variety of different groups to connect their service. The idea for this is, one, that we can help researchers get around their research lifecycle more efficiently with less loss of information by connecting all the services that they use together. And by connecting those services, we make researchers more efficient getting around the lifecycle, but also decrease the likelihood of error, of information going in and out of the different services they use. The analytics platform, where it's storage, with how they visualize their data, with writing it up for publication, et cetera. So if we can minimize error and increase efficiency getting around the life cycle, then researchers win. They get more efficient in doing their work. And by connecting all these services together, larger collaborative teams can use the same set of services, even though only a subset of them actually make use of them, right? So I might use GitHub because I'm familiar with command line and code, but one of my collaborators might not use GitHub. But by representing in the OSF in a simplified interface, I can still give those collaborators access to the code and scripts that we're using without them having to be a regular user of the service. And then a byproduct of all of that is that the entire process, that entire research lifecycle is more reproducible, because as we've connected these together, we can log what happens, actually follow the process of doing the research in order to make the entire thing more reproducible overall. So another example, so this is an open API, public API, so anybody can connect their services. And the goal is to make it so that any kind of service that supports research can be connected to the lifecycle. So for example, the Research Computing Center at Notre Dame has a computational services engine that they use for their researchers. They connected that to the OSF, and by connecting it to the OSF, then instead of having to negotiate developing API relationships with each individual repository, once it was connected to the OSF, then Notre Dame users of that computational platform could apply data that's stored in any environment that's already connected to the OSF, whether it's on Dropbox or Amazon S3 or in an own cloud service or Box.com or otherwise. And so the benefits can be moved rapidly to scale by connecting particular services that support one's own area of research. The other key part of the OSF is that it is a layered system, so that those core services at the base here, the ecosystem of connecting services together, the data upon which it's all collected, and then the services, authentication, security, management workflow, rendering in the browser, all of those things are modularized in components so that they can be put together in a variety of different ways with different interfaces applied to them. So the OSF is one interface to access all of those different services and all of that data and workflow management. But you can build any interface on top of that core set of services because it's completely modularized from how the information is visualized. So one example of that, just to illustrate, is a generalized preprint service that we have developed, and I'll show you some images of in a second. And that's at the second layer. And then that service is modularized so that it can be branded for any community to run their own version of that service. And so with the preprint service, we have 10 or 11 now different groups that have either launched or are soon to launch their own preprint service, all built on the OSF and done so very efficiently. And by this layering, we can enable scholarly communities to focus on the areas of expertise that they have. So, for example, SocArchive, an open archive for the social sciences, is run by sociologists, and they care very much about the content of the research in the preprints and their research community that is using preprints. But they aren't experts and don't really care about how security is managed in the service, that is stored, and what kind of databases are used. That's left to the technical experts to care about and focus their energies on. And then scholarly communication experts who think about information transmission and how preprint services can get designed, focus their efforts on designing that interface layer between them. And then the content area experts focus on just delivery of the service and engaging their scholarly community. And so this really provides a great deal of flexibility for the research community to be able to employ the same set of scholarly tools, scholarly commons, for a lot of different uses. It can open up more of the research lifecycle. So preprints are a way to make research more accessible to more people more quickly. And so if you go to osf.io/preprints, you can find the general search infrastructure. And this is an aggregated search across a variety of different preprint services, whether they're hosted by the Center for Open Science or not. And you can search against all of those in a single interface. And then simultaneously, each of those individual services has their own URL and place for them to manage their own service so that they can run preprints on their own. So if anybody's interested in starting a preprint service, please do contact. We're happy to engage you on launching a preprint service for your community. And I'm going to close so that there's a couple minutes for questions, but just to give an illustration of OSF Institutions as another view of that same set of core tools. I mentioned that Notre Dame Center for Research Computing computational service connection as an example, but institutions can sign up for OSF as an institutional service. It's a free service for institutions too, and then make it easy for their researchers to get onto the service, single sign-on capacity, so people can use their university credentials, and they can connect whatever services that they have in their research environment, like an institutional repository, to the OSF to make access of those services more efficient within their research community. There are a variety of different institutions that are already using OSF Institutions. This is just to illustrate. So let me close with that because there may be some questions and there's a few minutes left. But just to point you to some links where if you'd like to follow up with information to use any of these services. I didn't talk about training, but we have free trainings that can be done remotely or in person on open or reproducible practices. And we are a service organization. So if you have a service that you use and you want to connect to the OSF, if you have a community that you would like to make use of the OSF or get involved in the pre-reg challenge, or if you're a journal editor and want to pursue registered reports as a pilot for your journal, just feel free to get in touch with us for any of these things. And here are links, and if you Google my name, I come up. There aren't many Noseks in the world, so happy to chat. So thanks very much for your time and attention. I really appreciate it.
Brian, thanks so much for this great talk. We do have, actually, you got a lot of questions. I'm going to try and synthesize a few of them together, and maybe we can get through one or two of them. Obviously, the badge system that you've proposed here and described caught a lot of interest, and I think there's one or two questions around, well, actually, there's several questions around that, but maybe one or two key ones. One is it possible to apply the badges retrospectively or retroactively to work that's already published, and how far back could we go if that was possible? And secondly, how would abstract services or indexing services like the National Library of Medicine's PubMed or Medline support badges, do you think? Would it be possible, for instance, to add something like that to their search mechanisms or as a filter? So let's start with those two questions first.
Yeah, great questions. And the answer is yes, possible for both, and not active for both. So anybody can be a badge issuer. And one of the things that is in development, isn't in production yet, is a badge bakery, so that the badge itself has embedded in it metadata about who is the issuer, what was it issued for, if there's a DOI, inserting the DOI, et cetera. And that is to provide as much flexibility as possible for these different kinds of uses, retrospective, prospective, different groups applying badges, and then make them machine readable, excuse me, and recoverable across a variety of different issuers. So yes, that's possible. And also for the latter point on getting badges integrated with NLM or other services, we're very interested in pursuing those kinds of solutions, because the real power of things like badges are when they move to scale, right? It's great to show an example in a single journal, but really the practice as a normative practice, and especially getting integrated with things like 1CB and other mechanisms of reward, right? You can submit to your institution what portion of your data is openly accessible for others as a mechanism of indicating good process. That will only work when it moves to scale. And so we're very interested in pursuing collaborations like with NLM and other groups for that.
Great. So maybe one last question before we go, and this is more of a sort of personal question, as a couple of people have asked this, but as a leader in this field, what was the moment that sort of got you into open science? What was the light bulb or the point in time which you sort of thought and saw that this was a key issue?
Yeah, I suspect that my experience is like a lot of people's, where I didn't realize that science wasn't open when I started in it. And so it was only when I got into grad school and I took a methodology class with Alan Kasdan my first year, where I realized, we read all of these papers from the 60s and 70s, all these challenges of how science is done and what the reality is, and I was sort of stunned by that, right? Oh, I thought it was sort of like how we talked about in second grade. I'm curious about a question and I study it, and then I write down what I did and I share that with other people, and then they say, oh, well, what about this? What about that? And the fact that it doesn't operate like that was sort of an awakening. My lab in grad school and in my lab since I've been a faculty member, I've always had a technical part of the lab. We've always just built tools to try to make our research more efficient and more useful and more accessible. So I just sort of said we can make our own data more available even if we can't, even if the field isn't operating that way. And so we've always had that. We've always been applying for grants that try to increase, build tools to make things more accessible. But the actual, the development of the Center for Open Science, which is a spin out from my lab, really was sort of not a plan, but sort of a grasping at an opportunity that sort of appeared. So I didn't talk about our reproducibility projects, but we've done some large-scale replication projects of studies in psychology first, my field, and we have one ongoing now in cancer biology. And we started to do that replication project just as a lab project, the one for psychology, at the same time that we were building sort of an initial version of the Open Science Framework. And that got a lot of press attention. And then funders started calling. And our primary funder, the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, gave us a $5.25 million award in order to start the center. And so what was sort of aspirations that were realistic of wouldn't it be great if we could build some tools that help a few people turned into, oh my gosh, we could really start an organization and maybe really push on this. Let's go for it. And so that was, that gift just really changed the direction of how we did this.
Okay, well, we're at time, so it's 10 o'clock on the West Coast. So again, Brian, thank you for your wonderful insights on this. It was inspirational to hear a lot of this work. And we'll end this session here.
Thanks very much. I appreciate everybody attending.